The ship broke out of faster-than-light travel with a soft shudder, and for the first time in human history, a human crew looked out at another star system that was not their own. The stars were different here. The light felt older. The crew of the Ardent Pioneer stood at the observation windows and said nothing for a long time. There were no words big enough for the moment. Captain Yara Solis pressed her hand against the cold glass and exhaled slowly. Behind her, yet the rest of the crew were doing the same thing, just breathing, just looking. 17 people from 17 different countries, floating in a metal ship between stars that had never heard a human voice before. It was the year 2291, and humanity had finally done it. They had crossed the Great Silence. The message came 4 days later. It was not threatening. It was not even unfriendly. It was polite, and that was almost worse. The transmission came from something that called itself the Galactic Concordat, and it said in perfectly translated English that humanity had been observed for some time, that the Concordat extended its warmest welcome, and that a formal ceremony of induction would be arranged at the nearest Concordat station within the month. It also said, almost as an afterthought, that humanity would be required to sign a membership charter before any further travel through Concordat-recognized space. That nobody on Earth slept well that night. The Concordat station was enormous. It was the size of a small moon, hanging in space like a city that had grown too proud to stay on any planet. When the human delegation arrived, 12 people in clean uniforms, doing their best to look like they belonged. They were greeted by 17 species. Some had scales, some had too many eyes. Some moved in ways that human eyes found uncomfortable to follow. All of them were smiling in their own ways. Director General Sable Marin led the human delegation. She was 61 years old, with short gray hair and the kind of face that had spent decades in rooms where everyone was lying to each other. She had been a diplomat for 30 years. She knew a trap when she saw one. She also knew that sometimes you had to walk into the trap anyway because the alternative was worse. The ceremony was beautiful. There was music, strange and harmonic and ancient. There were speeches from 17 species about unity and peace and the great journey of civilization. Marin stood at the podium and gave her own speech, and she meant every word of it. Humanity wanted peace. Humanity wanted cooperation. Humanity was ready to be part of something larger than itself. Then they handed her the charter. It was a long document. It had been translated into English, but some of the concepts did not translate cleanly, which Marin noted immediately. She asked for 3 days to review it. They gave her 2. Her legal team worked without sleeping. What they found was not written with cruelty. It was worse than that. It was written with logic. The cold, clean logic of people who had been managing younger species for centuries and had gotten very good at making the cage sound reasonable. Humanity was classified as a Tier 3 juvenile species. This classification, the charter explained, was not an insult. And it was simply an acknowledgement of humanity's young age in the interstellar community. Most species began at Tier 3. It was perfectly normal. There was even a small ceremony for it. What Tier 3 meant, in practice, was this. Humanity could not vote in Concordat sessions. Humanity could not develop weapons above a Class 4 rating, which was roughly equivalent to what Earth already had, meaning they were allowed to keep what they had, but could never build anything better. Humanity could not establish colonies on unclaimed worlds without a Concordat review, which could take anywhere from 5 to 50 years, and humanity could not trade directly with other civilizations. All trade had to go through an assigned custodian race who would act as an intermediary and take a fee for the service. The custodian assigned to humanity was a species called the Vreth. Marin had met the Vreth representative on the first day. His name was something like Goral, and though the translation was approximate. He was tall and pale and slightly damp-looking, the way all Vreth were, and he had spent the entire welcome ceremony standing in a corner, watching the humans with small, calculating eyes. When Marin had introduced herself, he had smiled with too many teeth and said he looked forward to a long and productive relationship. She had smiled back and thought, there it is. The Vreth had been managing Tier 3 species for 200 years. They had turned it into a business. They took a percentage of every trade deal, a licensing fee for every route, a processing charge for every application. They did not do this through force. They did it through paperwork, through a system so complex and so well embedded in concordant law that extracting yourself from it was practically impossible once you were inside. 3 other species were currently under Vreth custodianship. None of them looked happy about it. Marin took the charter back to her team. They spent the last of their 2 days going through it line by line. They found some things they could negotiate. They found most things they could not. On the morning of the signing, one of her advisors, a young man named Daishi Okafor, put down his coffee and said, "This is the most politely worded act of enslavement in recorded history." Marin looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Write that down. We may need it later." She signed the charter. Back on Earth, the reaction was divided. Some people celebrated. Humanity was in the club, after all, whatever the terms. Some people were angry. Protests formed outside government buildings in a dozen cities. One retired admiral went on a popular broadcast and used Okafor's exact phrase, which had somehow leaked to the press, and was immediately contacted by the Concordate's communications office and told that such language was unhelpful to the spirit of cooperation. The admiral responded that she had not signed any charter restricting her speech, and hung up. Marin, back on the station, sat alone in the room they had given her delegation and looked out at the stars. They were beautiful. They had always been beautiful. She had wanted to reach them her whole life, and now here she was. And the first thing the stars had done was hand her a leash. She thought about the Vreth representative, about his too-many-teeth smile, about the 3 other species watching the signing ceremony with faces that said, "Welcome to the club you didn't choose to join." She thought about the charter, and the things she had found in it, and the things she had not found yet but suspected were there. She thought about humanity, impatient, restless, stubborn, her brilliant humanity, and what it tended to do when someone told it what it was not allowed to become. Then she opened her personal notebook and wrote 1 sentence at the top of an empty page. Read everything. Find the door they forgot to lock. She closed the notebook, turned off the light, and went to sleep. There was a lot of work ahead, and she intended to start early. Outside, the station hummed around her, ancient and vast and very sure of itself. And the Concordat had managed young species for centuries. It knew how this went. It did not yet know about humanity's particular talent for reading fine print. 30 years passed. On the surface, not much changed. Human ships traveled the trade routes the Vreth allowed them. Human diplomats attended Concordate sessions and sat in the back rows, where Tier 3 species were placed, and listened without speaking, because they had no vote and no official voice. Inhuman scientists filed colonization requests for 11 promising worlds, and received back 11 responses that said the same thing in slightly different words. Your application is under review. Expected processing time, indeterminate. The Vreth collected their fees. The Concordat ran its meetings. The elder species looked at humanity and saw a young civilization learning to behave itself. They were not watching closely enough. In a shipyard orbiting Europa, a team of engineers finished the final design pass on a new class of freight hauler. It was a big, ugly ship, wide in the body, built for cargo, not comfort. It had the kind of hull plating you only needed if you expected to fly through debris fields regularly, which freight haulers sometimes did. It had modular cargo bays that could be reconfigured in under 4 hours, which was useful for carrying different kinds of loads. And its drive core was powerful. More powerful than a ship of its size technically needed to be, but the engineers noted in their filing that the extra output improved fuel efficiency on long hauls, which the Concordate's trade office accepted without question. The ship was classified as a civilian vessel. It was, by every measure in the Concordate Charter, completely legal. There were 400 of them built over the next 20 years. Nobody in the Concordate looked twice. Freight haulers were boring. Freight haulers were what Tier 3 species were supposed to build. Practical, small-scale, non-threatening. The Concordate's monitoring office logged the ships and moved on to more interesting things. Meanwhile, on a small orbital station near the edge of human-approved space, Director General Marin's office ran what was officially described as a cultural exchange and diplomatic liaison program. Its budget was modest. Its staff was small. It produced quarterly reports on interspecies relations that were thorough, professional, and deeply uninteresting to anyone who read them, which was the point. What the program actually did was make friends. There were hundreds of species in and around Concordate space. Most of them were Tier 3, same as humanity, classified as young, watched, managed, taxed through their custodian intermediaries. Many of them had been in that position for decades. A few had been there for over a century, and trapped in the same circular system, watching Tier 1 species vote on decisions that affected their lives without ever being asked. 3 of those species became something more than acquaintances. The Keth were insectoid, 6-limbed, fast-thinking, with a natural talent for engineering that even Tier 1 species quietly respected. They had been under Vreth custodianship for 40 years and had built some of the most elegant propulsion systems in the known galaxy, most of which the Vreth had taken credit for in Concordate trade filings. The Keth were not angry about this in a loud way. They were angry in a quiet, precise way, the kind that made better plans. The Orani were avian, with long feathered limbs and voices like layered harmonics. They were, without question, the best traders in known space. They understood value and leverage and the timing of an offer better than any species the Concordate had ever catalogued. Had the Vreth had been skimming 20% off every Orani trade deal for 60 years. The Orani had been counting every single credit. The Dul were the strangest of the 3. They were silicon-based, slow-moving, and almost entirely silent in person. But they had a memory that did not fade. A Dul who witnessed something remembered it completely and permanently. Every word, every number, every transaction, every broken promise. They had been watching the Vreth for 90 years, and they remembered all of it. Marin's liaison office began hosting small meetings. They were framed as cultural exchanges, shared meals, language study sessions, joint academic seminars. The Concordate Monitoring Office reviewed 3 of these events and concluded they were exactly what they appeared to be. In the back room of a cultural exchange seminar on a neutral station, Marin sat across from a Keth engineer named Chivis, an Orani trader named Yaral, and the Dul representative the others simply called Elder, and she said, "I want to show you something." She placed a copy of the Concordate's founding charter on the table. It was the original document, not the working copy that everyone operated from, but the actual founding text written 400 years ago by 17 species, some of whom no longer existed. She had spent 3 years tracking down the original filing, and 2 more years having her best legal minds go through it. The working copy had been quietly edited over the centuries. Small changes, each one individually defensible, each one collectively carving out a bit more power for the Tier 1 species at the top. But the founding document was a matter of public legal record. It could not be altered retroactively, and inside it, buried in a subsection that dealt with the rights of founding species, most of whom were now extinct, was a single clause that had been copied into every version of the charter but never used, because no Tier 3 species had ever been in a position to use it. The clause of sovereign equivalence. The language was old and formal, but the meaning was clear. Any species that could demonstrate cultural development, technological capability, and a diplomatic standing equivalent to a Tier 1 civilization could file a petition for immediate reclassification. The petition had to meet a specific set of standards. It had to be filed formally in the Grand Chamber, and, this was the part that mattered, the Council could not legally refuse a valid petition. The clause had been placed there by a species called the Vorathi, who had believed deeply in the idea that civilization should be a ladder, not a ceiling. The Vorathi had died out 200 years ago. Their clause had sat in the founding document ever since, untouched, because every Tier 3 species that might have used it had been kept carefully below the threshold required to qualify. Marin had spent 15 years quietly making sure humanity, and now 3 allies, were no longer below that threshold. Elder the Dual looked at the clause for a long time. Then they said, in their slow and measured way, that they had personally witnessed every instance of Vreth resource extraction from their people over 90 years, and that they could reproduce the complete record in any legal format required. Yarrow the Irani spread their feathers slightly, the avian equivalent of a smile, and said they had 60 years of trade discrepancies documented to the last credit. Chivis the Keth said nothing, but pulled out a design file for a propulsion system so advanced it benchmarked above anything currently in Tier 1 use and slid it across the table. Marin looked at the 3 of them. "We don't file until we're ready," she said, "and we're not ready yet. But I think in 5 years, we will be." Outside the small room, the cultural exchange seminar continued. Someone was giving a presentation about Orani music. An attendant was refilling drinks. Everything looked exactly as it was supposed to look. That was the whole idea. The stars outside the station window did not know that the ground had just shifted. The Concordat did not know. The Vreth, collecting their fees and filing their reports and congratulating themselves on 4 centuries of smooth management, did not know. But somewhere in a small room on a neutral station, 4 species had just decided that the waiting was almost over. They shook hands in their different ways. And then they went back to the seminar and sat through a very long talk about bird songs, and smiled and said nothing at all. The fleet exercise was not a secret. It was not supposed to be. 400 vessels, human freight haulers, Keth engineering ships, Orani trade runners, and 7 slow dual observation platforms gathered in a stretch of neutral space between 3 star systems and ran a joint navigation drill for 6 days. They shared frequencies. They flew in coordinated patterns. And they tested communication protocols across 4 different species systems and found that everything worked exactly as planned. Then they went home. The Concordat's monitoring office filed an urgent report within 48 hours. By the time the report reached the full council, it had passed through 7 review committees and grown from 2 pages to 63. Each committee had added their own analysis, their own alarm, their own carefully worded suggestions for what should be done. The consensus, by the time it reached the Grand Chamber, was that humanity had committed what one Tier 1 species called an act of unauthorized cooperative militarization. None of the ships had fired a weapon. None of them had entered Concordat-protected space. None of them had violated a single line of the Charter. But the elder species in the chamber had been managing Tier 3 civilizations for a long time, and they recognized what coordination looked like, and they did not like it. Igoril, the Vreth representative, older now with more teeth showing, stood before the chamber and demanded sanctions. He used the word destabilizing 11 times in a 20-minute speech. He suggested that humanity's custodianship be transferred to a stricter overseer. He proposed a formal review of all Tier 3 species travel permissions. He was, in the language of galactic diplomacy, furious, and he was making sure everyone knew it. Several Tier 1 species agreed with him. Not all. A few of the elder races sat in silence, watching, the way very old and very careful thinkers sometimes did when they suspected something larger was happening than what was visible on the surface. But enough agreed. The mood in the chamber was moving toward punishment. Then the doors opened. Sable Marin walked in. She was 91 years old. She moved slowly with a cane. But her back was straight, and her eyes were the same as they had always been, clear and still and quietly dangerous. Behind her came Chivis of the Keth, Yerel of the Orani, and Elder of the Duel, each of them followed by a small legal team carrying documents in physical and digital form. They walked to the center of the chamber floor, which was reserved for official petitioners, and they stopped there and waited. Gorel looked at them. His small eyes narrowed. That the chamber president, an ancient four-armed being from a species called the Sovan, asked Marin to identify her purpose. Marin reached into the folder under her arm and placed a formal document on the submission table in the center of the floor. Director General Sable Marin, representing the sovereign people of Earth and its associated species, she said, in a voice that did not waver at all, and hereby files a petition of sovereign equivalence under Article 47 of the Concordat Founding Charter on behalf of humanity, the Keth, the Orani, and the Duel, simultaneously and jointly. The chamber went very quiet. It was the kind of quiet that happened when something said an old word in a new way. Several council members turned to their legal advisors. Several legal advisors pulled up archive files with expressions that suggested they had not expected to need them today. And the Vreth delegation began speaking rapidly among themselves in low voices. The chamber president called for a recess. Marin said politely that a recess was not required. The petition was complete as filed. The article did not provide for a recess before acknowledgement, and she was prepared to present the supporting evidence immediately. The president consulted with the senior legal recorder. The legal recorder confirmed, with visible discomfort, that the Director General was correct. The presentation took 3 hours. Marin's team had prepared it for 15 years. They presented humanity's cultural output, art, philosophy, science, literature, across 3 centuries of interstellar existence, benchmarked against the standards used to evaluate Tier 1 species at the time of their own reclassification. The benchmarks were not arbitrary. They were the Concordat's own numbers, pulled from its own historical records. Humanity met or exceeded every single one. The technological presentation was led by Chivis, who walked the chamber through 7 areas of engineering in which Keth-human collaborative development had produced results that placed them ahead of several current Tier 1 civilizations. The propulsion system alone drew a long silence from the technical observers in the upper galleries. The diplomatic evidence was presented by Yerel, who produced documentation of 43 independent civilizations outside the Concordat, with whom the 4 petitioning species had established formal relations, trading agreements, cultural exchanges, mutual aid frameworks, not through the Concordat, not through any custodian intermediary, directly. The chamber did not know most of these civilizations were in contact with anyone. Then Elder stood up. The Duel moved to the center of the floor and, without notes, began to speak. And they spoke for 40 minutes. In that time, they recited from memory 91 years of Vreth resource extraction. Every trade deal, every fee, every filing that had attributed Keth engineering to Vreth brokers, every colonization application that had been delayed without legal cause, every credit that had moved from Tier 3 species to Vreth accounts through mechanisms that were legal only because the Vreth had spent a century writing the mechanisms themselves. Every number was exact. And every date was exact. Every transaction was exact. When Elder finished, the chamber was very, very still. Gorel stood up and said the petition was not valid. He said it with confidence, the way a person says something when they are trying to make it true by saying it. The Chamber's legal recorder stood up and said, with professional flatness, that the petition met all requirements of Article 47 as written in the founding document. She paused and added that she was referring to the founding document, not the working copy, and that there was a difference, and that the difference had been noted in the petition's filing appendix and was available for review. Another long silence. Several Tier 1 representatives requested time to review the evidence. One, a species called the Yendar, who were old even by concordate standards, said nothing for a very long time and then said quietly, and that they thought the petition appeared to be in order. Goral said this was irregular, unprecedented, destabilizing. Myron, still standing at the submission table, said that unprecedented was not the same as illegal. Goral said this required further investigation. Marin said that Article 47 did not provide for investigation before acknowledgement. Goral said he would be filing a counter-objection. Marin said he was welcome to, and that she looked forward to hearing the legal basis for it, and that she would wait. She sat down. Her legal team sat down. Chivis and Yeral and Elder sat down. The four of them sat in the center of the grand chamber of the Concordat, in the seat reserved for petitioners, and they waited with the patience of people who had been waiting for a very long time already and were very good at it. The chamber president called a recess. This time, nobody argued. Outside the chamber, in the long corridor of the Concordat station, Marin's young aide, Deshi Okafor, gray-haired now, but still the same person who had coined the phrase about politely worded enslavement, handed her a cup of tea and said nothing. She drank it slowly. Outside the great windows of the station, stars burned in the dark. The council had the document. The council had the evidence. The council had the law, written by their own founders, and it did not say what they wanted it to say. That they would try to find a way around it. She knew that. She had known that for 15 years. She had planned for that, too. The delay started with a committee. That was how it always started, in the Concordat. When the elder species did not like something but could not legally stop it, they formed a committee to study it. The Committee for the Review of Sovereign Equivalence Petitions was established 12 days after Marin's filing. It had 19 members, met twice a month, and then had a mandate to produce a report within, and this was the part that made Marin's legal team set down their drinks and stare. An unspecified but reasonable time frame. The committee met. It reviewed. It requested additional documentation. When the documentation was provided, it requested clarification of the documentation. When the clarification was provided, it requested independent verification of the clarification. It was a machine designed to run forever, and it ran beautifully. Then a security investigation was opened into the Joint Fleet exercise. The investigation was run by the Concordat's Enforcement Office, which was technically independent of the Council, but was, in practice, staffed almost entirely by representatives of Tier 1 species. The investigation requested that all 4 petitioning species provide records of their communications for the past 5 years. Marin's office responded with a politely worded document noting that the charter did not grant the Enforcement Office access to sovereign diplomatic records without a finding of criminal conduct and asking for the specific charter article the investigation was operating under. The Enforcement Office took 3 weeks to respond. The article they cited did not say what they claimed it said. Marin wrote back and pointed this out, paragraph by paragraph. And the Enforcement Office did not respond for another month. In the Grand Chamber, a Tier 1 species called the Mahar proposed a new subclassification within the Tier 3 category, something called Advanced Developmental Status, which would provide some additional benefits to qualifying species while still falling short of Tier 1 standing. It was clearly designed as an off-ramp, thus a way to give humanity something that looked like a victory without the Concordat actually having to give up control. 3 other Tier 1 species co-signed the proposal. Marin read the proposal carefully. She had her legal team read it. She had the Keth engineers read it. She had the Orani traders read it, and Yaral, who understood the value of an offer better than almost anyone alive, looked up from the document and said in their layered harmonic voice, "This is a slightly bigger cage." Marin declined the proposal in writing, citing Article 47, which did not provide for alternative classifications as a substitute for a valid petition ruling. Months passed, then a year. The committee was still meeting. The investigation was still investigating. The council was still deliberating. The petition sat in the legal record, valid and unresolved, like a splinter that the Concordat could not quite reach. And then Sable Marin did something nobody expected. She stopped asking, not loudly, not with a declaration or a speech or an ultimatum. She simply sent a single memo, distributed to the captains of every human freight hauler in operation, and the memo said that all vessels were to begin a scheduled maintenance rotation, effective immediately, with an expected return to service date of pending resolution of outstanding legal matters. 400 ships went dark. For the first 3 days, the Concordat's Trade Management Office did not fully understand what was happening. Routes were delayed, cargo arrivals were pushed back, processing centers filed routine complaints. This happened sometimes. Equipment broke. Crews got sick. It was normal. By day 7, it was not normal. Humanity's freight haulers had been doing a job that nobody in the Concordat had really noticed them doing, not because it was invisible, but because it had become so routine that it had blended into the background of how things worked. They carried goods between species that didn't share transit routes. They filled gaps in supply chains that older, more established carriers considered too small to bother with. They moved the smaller, less glamorous cargo that kept dozens of mid-sized civilizations running day to day. Over 30 years, and they had quietly woven themselves into the fabric of interstellar commerce the way thread weaves into cloth, unremarkable until the cloth starts to come apart. At day 15, 2 Concordat member worlds reported food supply disruptions. At day 20, a Tier 2 species called the Brenhal contacted the Concordat's trade office in a state of distress because 6 months of medical shipments had not arrived. At day 30, the Keth engineering vessels announced they would also be entering a maintenance cycle, and the Orani trade runners stopped accepting new bookings, and 7 supply lines that ran through Orani negotiated routes simply went quiet. The Concordat's trade office produced an emergency report. The report was 30 pages long and said in many different ways that the situation was serious. Then it got more serious. A Vreth military fleet, 42 vessels, all of them well above Class 4, departed Vreth space on a heading toward the inner edge of human-approved territory. The official communication from the Vreth government described it as a routine patrol and compliance verification exercise. Nobody believed this. It was a show of force, the kind that had worked many times before, the kind that reminded a young species who held the real power in the galaxy, and what happened when they stepped out of line. And the fleet arrived at the transit corridor that led into human space and stopped. In front of them, parked across the corridor in a dense, overlapping formation that stretched from one side to the other, were 316 human freight haulers. They were not in attack formation. They were not pointed at the Vreth ships. They were just there. Engines running, navigation lights on, crew at their stations, quiet. And the Vreth fleet commander sent a communication demanding the vessels clear the corridor. A human traffic coordinator responded that the vessels were currently in maintenance cycle holding patterns and were not able to maneuver until their technical reviews were complete. She asked if the Vreth fleet would like to be placed in a waiting queue. She said it pleasantly, the way a person says something when they want you to know they are entirely serious. The Vreth fleet sat for 6 days. They did not fire. They could not fire at unarmed civilian vessels in neutral space without violating the same charter they had spent a century hiding behind. They scanned the haulers and found that the ships were, technically, civilian vessels. They were also, and this was the part that made the Vreth fleet commander go very still, clearly carrying enough modular firepower to end the confrontation before it began, and the crews had the calm, unhurried faces of people who were not afraid. So on the 6th day, the Vreth fleet turned around and went home. The Concordat's emergency session was called 48 hours later. In the Grand Chamber, the mood was different from before. The Tier 1 species who had been comfortable with delays were less comfortable now. 3 of them had economies that were visibly hurting. One had already sent a private message to Marin's office asking what it would take to reach a resolution quickly, not as a concordat communication, but as a quiet conversation between parties who understood each other. Marin read that message twice. Then she called Chivis and Yarrell and Elder and told them it was time to come back. She also had her legal team pull out a second document, one she had been keeping ready for 5 years just in case. It was a draft treaty, a new one, written from the ground up, designed to replace the Concordat Charter's most damaging elements. They had been working on it since the same night they had found the clause of sovereign equivalence. The world did not need a better cage. It needed a different system entirely. She put the document in her folder, picked up her cane, and walked back toward the Grand Chamber. The Concordat had tried waiting her out. It had tried committees and investigations and counter-proposals and military gestures. None of it had worked. Because none of it had accounted for the simplest fact about humanity. When you take something away from them, they find out exactly how much it was worth to you. Now it was time to finish what they had started 30 years ago in a small room at a cultural exchange seminar. The stars were waiting. They had waited long enough. The Grand Chamber had seen many things in 400 years. It had seen the induction of civilizations and the mourning of ones that had died out. It had seen wars declared and wars ended and treaties written in the careful language of people who did not fully trust each other. It had seen great speeches and terrible decisions and small acts of courage that nobody remembered afterward. It was a room built to contain the weight of galactic history, and it was very good at it. But the session that began on the morning of the 43rd day of the maintenance cycle was something different. Even the oldest members of the chamber, the ones who had been attending sessions for longer than most civilizations had been spacefaring, sat a little more upright than usual. Something was happening. Everyone could feel it, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. Marin walked in first, then Chivis, then Yarrell, then Elder. They took their seats in the center of the floor, same as before, same as always, and they waited. The chamber president, the ancient Sovan, who had presided over this chamber for 60 years and had seen most things, looked at them for a moment and then looked at the full assembly and called the session to order. The legal recorder stood. She had the face of someone who had spent the past 43 days going through every document, every counter-argument, every procedural option, and had reached a conclusion she did not enjoy but could not dispute. She spoke for 7 minutes. She cited 7 articles. And she said that the petition of sovereign equivalence filed by the 4 species before them was valid in all respects, that the review committee had produced no findings that constituted legal grounds for refusal, that the security investigation had produced no findings of criminal conduct, and that the article under which the petition had been filed did not provide for indefinite deferral. Then she said the part that made the Vreth delegation go completely still. She said the council was required to vote. Gorel stood immediately. He spoke for 20 minutes. He talked about process and precedent and the importance of careful deliberation. He talked about the stability of the concordat system and the risks of moving too quickly. He talked about the special needs of young species and the wisdom of experienced guidance. He used the word destabilizing 8 times, which was fewer than usual, but still more than anyone wanted to hear. When he sat down, something unexpected happened. The Yendar representative stood up. The Yendar were one of the oldest species in the Concordat. They had been founding members. They had been in the chamber for 400 years, and in 400 years they had never once broken from the Tier 1 block on a major vote. Every species in the room knew this. The Yendar's vote was considered automatic, a fixed point as reliable as a star. The Yendar representative spoke for 3 minutes, and she said that she had reviewed the petition carefully. She said that she had reviewed the original founding document even more carefully, including the section written by the Varathi, whose memory the Concordat officially honored every year at its anniversary ceremony while ignoring their most important contribution. She said that she had also reviewed the past 91 years of dual testimony that Elder had provided, and that she found it, in her words, made difficult to reconcile with the values this institution claims to hold. Then she said she would be voting in favor of the petition. The chamber's noise level, which had been the controlled murmur of professional beings conducting important business, briefly became something louder and less controlled. The president called for order. Order was restored slowly. 2 more Tier 1 species announced they would vote in favor. One said nothing and abstained, which was its own kind of statement. The Mahar, who had proposed the alternative subclassification, sat in visible discomfort and eventually voted in favor as well, perhaps because their private messages to Marin's office had made certain things clear about where the relationship was going. The vote was not unanimous. 7 Tier 1 species voted against. 3 abstained. But when the final count was read out, the result was clear. The petition of sovereign equivalence was upheld. All 4 species, humanity, the Keth, of the Orani, the Dual, were reclassified simultaneously and immediately. The Vreth custodianship over all 4 was dissolved. Any fees, licenses, or trade restrictions that had operated through the custodianship system were voided as of the moment the vote was certified. Goral did not speak. He sat in his chair with his too-many-teeth mouth closed and his small eyes fixed on a point on the floor, and he looked for the first time since Marin had met him, odd like a person who had just understood something they had not wanted to understand. Marin stood up. She thanked the chamber for its decision. She said it briefly and without ceremony, because this was not a moment for celebration. It was a moment for work. Then she placed the second document on the submission table, the Sovereign Compact. It was 48 pages long. It had been drafted by human legal scholars, reviewed by Keth engineers and Orani traders and the perfect memory of the Dual, and quietly consulted on by representatives from 31 of the 43 independent civilizations humanity had been in contact with over the past decades. It proposed the complete restructuring of the Concordate's membership system, the elimination of tier classifications, the replacement of custodianship with voluntary partnership agreements, had the establishment of equal voting rights for all member species regardless of age or development level, and a new framework for resource sharing and trade that did not allow any single species to act as an obligatory intermediary for another. It was, in the dry language of interstellar law, a revolution. The chamber sat with it for a long time. The president looked at it. The legal recorder looked at it. The several Tier 1 representatives looked at it with expressions ranging from thoughtful to alarmed. The Yendar representative read the first 10 pages and then looked up at Marin with something that might have been, in Yendar terms, respect. The vote on the Sovereign Compact did not happen that day. It took 8 more months of debate, revision, negotiation, and several very long sessions. Some articles were changed, some were strengthened. The one was removed entirely after the Mar objected to its language, and Yerl of the Orani negotiated a replacement version that was actually better than the original, which was the kind of thing the Orani did. But it passed. Not by a large margin, not without resistance. But it passed, and when the legal recorder certified the final count, and the president declared the Sovereign Compact adopted as the new governing framework of the Concordat, the chamber was quiet for a moment in the same way it had been quiet when Marin first filed her petition. The quiet of people understanding that something had changed in a way that could not be changed back. In the weeks that followed, the galactic press tried to explain what had happened. It was not easy to explain. They had expected a war, or at least a confrontation. Ships firing, borders drawn, ultimatums exchanged. What they had gotten instead was a legal filing, a maintenance cycle, and a corridor full of unarmed ships, and a vote. It did not make for exciting images. It made for a very strange story that kept getting more complex the more closely you looked at it. A Keth journalist asked Chivis what the key to the whole strategy had been, and Chivis said that the key was patience, and that humans were surprisingly good at patience when they had something specific to be patient for. A Vreth broadcast tried to frame the outcome as a minor administrative adjustment, and the broadcast was watched by approximately nobody because the Vreth's economic situation in the months following the dissolution of their custodianship network had made everyone too busy to watch broadcasts. Yarrell of the Irani gave a very long interview about trade philosophy and the nature of leverage, and it was later printed in 11 languages and studied in at least 4 different species diplomatic academies. Elder of the Duel began writing. The first volume of their history of the event was 2,000 pages long and covered only the first 30 years. It was, by all accounts, extraordinarily thorough. The title was "The Humans Were Always Talking to Each Other," and in the dedication, Elder wrote that they had never expected, in 91 years of watching and waiting, to be part of a story with this kind of ending. Somewhere in the middle of all of this, a Raketh journalist with a recorder found Marin sitting alone in the observation lounge of the Concordat station, looking out at the stars. The journalist asked her what humanity's strategy had been, right from the beginning, from the moment she had signed the charter all those years ago. Marin was quiet for a moment. She looked at the stars. Then she looked at the journalist, and she said, "We read the contract. And then we waited until we could make them regret writing it." The journalist published that quote the next day. It spread across 40 civilizations in a week. On 100 different worlds, in 100 different situations, beings who had been waiting for their own door to open read those words and felt something move in them. Something that had been sitting still for a long time and was now, finally, ready to stand up. In the outer rim, or on a quiet world that most of the Concordat had never heard of, a species called the Ta'avri filed their first formal petition under the new Sovereign Compact. Then another species filed, then another. The stars did not literally rearrange themselves. Stars do not do that. But the light between them changed slightly because the civilization that moved through that light was no longer the same shape it had been, and shapes cast different shadows. Humanity had not broken the galaxy, but it had not conquered it. It had simply read all the fine print, made all the right friends, and waited until the moment was exactly right. That, in the end, was enough.